The dark truth about door gunners begins the moment a helicopter slows down over hostile ground. An open doorway, no armor, no cover, just a man leaning out with a machine gun, while rifles and machine guns aim up from the jungle below. Every landing turns him into the most visible target in the sky. Every second exposes his body to fire that thin metal cannot stop. Door gunners were not elite commandos or specially protected warriors. They were ordinary soldiers, placed in an extraordinary position, half inside the aircraft, half outside the war. Their job was simple in theory and brutal in reality. Suppress the enemy, protect the crew, keep the helicopter alive. This story strips away the myth and the bravado. It reveals what the job truly demanded, how it was created out of desperation, and why the cost paid by door gunners was far higher than most people ever realized. When American helicopters arrived in Vietnam in the early 1960s, they were not seen as weapons. They were tools. Light utility aircraft meant to move men and supplies faster than trucks could on broken roads. Commanders believed speed and height would keep them safe. The jungle below was dangerous, but the sky felt separate from the fight. At first, that belief shaped everything. The most common helicopter was the UH-1 Iroquois, soon nicknamed the Huey. It was flown by a pilot and co-pilot, with a crew chief in the back. Their mission was simple: pick up soldiers, fly low over trees and rivers, land in small clearings, unload, and leave. No armor protected the cabin. No weapons covered the sides. The helicopter relied on movement alone. In planning rooms far from the jungle, this seemed reasonable. Reality arrived quickly. Vietnam was not an open battlefield. Enemy fighters did not stand in lines or wear clear uniforms. They hid in trees, rice fields, villages, and riverbanks. When helicopters descended to land, they slowed down. When they slowed down, they became targets. Small arms fire reached higher than expected. Rifles, machine guns, and later heavier weapons punched holes through thin aluminum skin. Crews began to notice the pattern. Helicopters went in clean and fast, then came out damaged or not at all. Bullets shattered windscreens, fuel lines ruptured, control cables snapped. A single lucky hit could send a helicopter spinning into the jungle. Rescue missions followed crashes, and those rescue helicopters were often fired on as well. Losses mounted month after month. Almost half of all helicopters deployed during the war would be destroyed or badly damaged. Not all were lost to enemy fire, but enough were to make one fact clear: air mobility alone was not protection. The sky was not safe. The helicopter was not invisible. It was loud, predictable, and vulnerable when close to the ground. At first, crews tried small adjustments. Pilots flew lower to stay under certain firing angles, then higher to avoid others. They zigzagged on approach. They landed faster and took off harder. Crew chiefs leaned out of doors to watch the ground more closely. None of this solved the core problem. The helicopter had no way to fight back. The turning point came not from high command, but from the crews themselves. Men who watched friends die inside unarmed aircraft began to improvise. If the helicopter was going to be shot at, then someone needed to shoot back. The simplest solution was the most dangerous one: remove the doors and give a machine gun to the man in the back. At first, this was informal and uneven. Crew chiefs carried personal weapons and fired when they could. The M60 machine gun became the preferred choice. It was powerful, reliable, and already in wide use. But it was never designed to be fired from a flying aircraft. There was no mount, no restraint. The gunner stood or crouched in an open doorway. bracing against vibration and wind. These early attempts were chaotic. The helicopter shook constantly. Rotor wash blurred vision. Empty shell casings bounced across the floor and out into open air. The gunner had to balance, aim, and fire while the aircraft banked and climbed. Still, even this rough fire had an effect. Enemy fighters ducked for cover. Some shots were suppressed. Some landings became survivable. Commanders noticed. Helicopters with guns came back more often than those without. Losses did not stop, but they slowed. What began as a desperate field solution started to become standard practice. Soon, helicopters were flying with at least one machine gun on board, even if no official position existed yet. This change altered the crew dynamic. The man in the back was no longer just a mechanic or observer. He became part of the fight. He watched the ground constantly. He warned pilots of obstacles, movement, and muzzle flashes. He fired not to destroy targets, but to create space, space to land, space to lift off, space to survive. Still, danger increased rather than decreased. Removing doors exposed the interior completely. Wind tore through the cabin. Rain soaked equipment. Bullets had nothing to stop them. The gunner was now the most visible and obvious threat to anyone on the ground. Enemy fighters learned quickly where to aim. As helicopter operations expanded, missions grew more complex. Insertions happened deeper into hostile areas. Extraction flights came under heavier fire. Helicopters began flying lower and slower to support troops on the ground. The need for constant covering fire became obvious. One gun was not enough. Each side of the aircraft needed protection. This was the moment when the door gunner role truly began to take shape. No longer an improvised task given to whoever was available, it became an expected part of the crew. Someone had to cover each open side. Someone had to stay alert every second of the flight. Someone had to accept that their body was between the aircraft and the enemy. Training adapted slowly. There was no formal school at first. New gunners learned in the air. Veterans showed them where to stand, how to brace, how to feed ammunition without tangling belts. Mistakes were immediate and sometimes fatal. A slipped footing or jammed gun could mean death in seconds. By the mid-1960s, helicopter crews understood the truth better than anyone else. They were not flying above the war. They were inside it. Every mission crossed invisible lines of fire. Every landing invited attention. The helicopter was both transport and target. By the middle of the war, helicopters were no longer entering combat zones by accident. They were being sent directly into danger on purpose. Troop insertions, extractions, resupply flights, and emergency evacuations all depended on rotary wing aircraft. With this shift came a new reality. Someone had to protect the helicopter from the ground at all times. The crew chief could not do everything alone. Watching engine gauges, scanning the aircraft, assisting pilots, and firing a machine gun at the same time was impossible. As missions became longer and more violent, commanders and crews accepted a simple truth: a dedicated gunner was needed. This was the moment the door gunner position was born, often called the shotgun rider. The role had no prestige. It came with no extra rank or pay. It came with exposure, danger, and responsibility. The shotgun rider sat or stood at the open doorway, facing outward, eyes locked on the jungle below. His job was to fire, observe, and warn. He covered one side of the aircraft while the crew chief covered the other. Together, they formed the helicopter's only defense. Early door gunners were not formally trained for this role. Most were young enlisted men, often in their late teens or early 20s. Some volunteered. Others were assigned without choice. They learned fast, or they did not survive long. The helicopter did not slow down for learning mistakes. Firing from an open helicopter was nothing like firing from the ground. The aircraft vibrated constantly. Wind tore at the gunner's arms and face. Noise drowned out thought. The machine gun bucked hard with every burst. Aiming required instinct more than calculation. Targets appeared and vanished in seconds. The gunner had to think ahead of everything. Ahead of the helicopter's movement, ahead of the enemy's motion, ahead of where the bullets would land. Bullets fired from a moving aircraft carried forward momentum. If the gunner aimed directly at a target, the rounds would often strike behind it. Learning to lead targets became essential. At the same time, the gunner had to watch the aircraft itself. Rotor blades passed close to trees and terrain. Skids could catch on branches or wires. A shouted warning at the right moment could save the crew. A missed warning could end the flight instantly. As enemy fire increased, helicopters began to take more hits during landing and takeoff. These moments were the most dangerous. The aircraft slowed down. The gunner became nearly stationary relative to the ground. Fire intensified from all directions. The door gunner's job during these seconds was brutal and simple. Fire constantly and keep heads down. Mounting the machine gun became a priority. At first, guns were held by hand or supported by simple straps. This was exhausting and unstable. Crews began installing pintle mounts and swivel mounts in the doorways. These mounts allowed the gunner to rest some of the weapon's weight and control recoil better. They also allowed a wider arc of fire. Even with mounts, many gunners preferred flexibility over stability. Some tied the M60 to bungee cords attached to the ceiling. This allowed the gun to hang and swing freely. Others removed mounts entirely. Every gunner had his own method. Comfort mattered less than survival. The enemy adapted quickly. Once they realized helicopters carried machine guns, they changed tactics. Fighters waited until the helicopter committed to landing. They fired from concealed positions. They aimed at the open doors first. Door gunners became priority targets. Casualties reflected this. Door gunners suffered some of the highest injury and death rates among helicopter crews. Their position was exposed. Their movement was limited. Their task required constant visibility. Stories spread among crews about short life expectancy. The number often quoted was 5 minutes. While not accurate, it captured how dangerous the job felt. Despite this, the role became essential. Helicopters without gunners were avoided whenever possible. Ground troops trusted gunships and armed transports more than unarmed aircraft. Suppressive fire from the air could break ambushes and allow soldiers to move. Door gunners became symbols of protection to men on the ground. Daily life for a door gunner followed an uneven rhythm. Long hours of flight, with nothing happening. Endless scanning of green terrain. Then sudden violence, without warning. A burst of fire. A sharp bank. A scream over the intercom. The shift from boredom to terror happened instantly. Safety equipment was minimal. Most helicopters used a simple lap belt similar to a car seat belt. This kept the gunner from sliding out but did not prevent falling during violent maneuvers. Many gunners preferred the monkey harness. This harness attached to the torso and clipped into the aircraft. It allowed movement while providing a last chance if thrown outward. Even with a harness, falling was possible. Helicopters performed sharp turns to evade fire. If struck and destabilized, centrifugal force could pull a gunner outward. In some cases, gunners fell partially out and were left hanging until pulled back inside. Others were not so lucky. The psychological pressure grew with every mission. Door gunners watched tracers rise toward them. They heard rounds strike metal inches away. They felt impacts through the floor and walls. They knew That armor would not stop most bullets. Flak jackets were heavy and offered little protection against rifle fire. Many chose not to wear them in the heat. Helmets were worn mainly for communication. Chest plates existed, but they were bulky and limited movement. Mobility often mattered more than protection. The gunner needed to lean out, shift position, and track targets quickly. Extra weight slowed reaction. By the late 1960s, the door gunner was no longer an experiment. He was a necessity. Helicopter crews entering hostile areas expected enemy fire, and they expected the door gunners to answer it immediately. What changed now was not the danger, but the level of skill required to survive it. Flying and shooting at the same time demanded constant coordination. The gunner could not act alone. Every movement of the helicopter affected his aim. Every burst of fire depended on how the pilot banked, climbed, or dropped altitude. Over time, crews learned to function as a single system. Pilots adjusted flight paths to give gunners better angles. Gunners learned to read the helicopter's motion before it happened. This coordination was not taught in classrooms. It was learned in the air. New gunners watched experienced ones closely. They learned how to brace their legs against the floor, how to lean with the aircraft instead of fighting it, how to fire in controlled bursts to avoid overheating the barrel. Mistakes were corrected immediately, sometimes violently, by incoming fire. One of the hardest skills to master was target identification. The jungle was dense and alive. Shadows moved constantly. Smoke drifted through trees. Villages appeared suddenly beneath the aircraft. The enemy did not wear uniforms that stood out. Movement was often the only clue. The gunner had seconds to decide. A flash, a shape, a line of disturbed leaves. If he waited too long, the helicopter might be hit. If he fired too quickly, he risked striking civilians. This pressure never eased. Every flight forced the gunner to make judgment calls that carried permanent consequences. Accuracy from the air was far more difficult than most people imagined. The helicopter moved forward at high speed, even when appearing to hover. Bullets fired from the machine gun inherited that motion. The gunner had to aim ahead of targets, sometimes far ahead, depending on speed and angle. This required instinct built through repetition. Wind added another layer of difficulty. Rotor wash kicked debris upward. Rain blurred vision. Smoke from previous strikes obscured the ground. The machine gun vibrated violently, shaking hands and arms. Maintaining control for long bursts was exhausting. Fatigue set in quickly, especially during extended missions. As gunners improved, enemy fire intensified. Fighters learned to wait for moments when helicopters slowed down. Landings, extractions, and hovering insertions became ambush points. Fire came from multiple directions at once. Tracers arced upward like glowing threads. The gunner's world narrowed to noise, motion, and flashes of light. During these moments, suppression mattered more than precision. The goal was not to hit specific targets, but to force heads down. Continuous fire created a temporary shield of sound and fear. This allowed the helicopter to land, load, or escape. The gunner often fired until the belt ran dry, then shouted for more ammunition. Ammunition management became its own challenge. Boxes of linked rounds slid across the floor during sharp turns. Belts tangled easily. Clearing jams under fire required calm hands and muscle memory. A jam at the wrong moment could be fatal. The physical strain was constant. Gunners stood or crouched for hours. They leaned into open air with nothing supporting their weight except their own grip. Muscles burned. Hands went numb from vibration. Hearing damage was common despite helmets. Sleep came in short bursts between missions. Despite this, Camaraderie within crews deepened. Pilots trusted their gunners with their lives. Crew chiefs relied on them to cover blind spots. Small rituals formed. Taps on the shoulder, hand signals, shared looks after surviving another hot landing. The helicopter became a small moving world where every man depended on the others. As experience grew, so did experimentation. Crews began adding more weapons to helicopters. Rocket pods appeared on external mounts. Forward-firing guns were installed. Some aircraft carried miniguns capable of firing thousands of rounds per minute. Door gunners now worked alongside heavier firepower. This changed their role again. They were no longer the only guns on board. They became part of a layered defense. Rockets and fixed guns struck targets ahead. Door gunners covered the sides and rear. The helicopter transformed from transport into flying fire platform. However, this evolution brought new risks. Heavier weapons attracted heavier resistance. Enemy fighters responded with heavier machine guns and coordinated fire. Helicopters flew lower and slower to support ground troops, increasing exposure. The sky filled with more danger, not less. The mental toll increased alongside the physical one. Door gunners saw the effects of their fire up close. They saw bodies scatter. They saw villages emptied. They saw wounded soldiers pulled aboard, screaming and bleeding. They watched friends die in the same doorway where they stood. There was no time to process these moments. Another mission followed, another flight path over the same jungle, another set of decisions that could not be undone. Fear became constant background noise. Those who survived learned to live with it rather than defeat it. By this stage of the war, door gunners were experienced professionals shaped by necessity. They were no longer learning whether helicopters belonged in combat. That question had been answered. Now they were learning how far helicopters could be pushed and how much punishment a human body could take while hanging in open air with a machine gun. As the war pushed deeper into the late 1960s, helicopters were no longer treated as support tools that happened to carry weapons. They were now expected to fight. This shift changed everything for the crews, and especially for the door gunners who stood at the edge of the aircraft. The Huey itself began to change. Early versions had been light and flexible, but too vulnerable. New variants were modified to carry more firepower and survive longer under fire. External mounts appeared on both sides of the fuselage. Rocket pods were bolted on. Fixed machine guns were added to fire forward along the flight path. The helicopter was becoming something new. This transformation did not happen smoothly. Many early modifications came from field units rather than factories. Crews tested ideas in combat. Some worked, others failed immediately. Door gunners often witnessed these experiments firsthand, standing only feet away from new weapons that shook the entire airframe when fired. The introduction of the minigun marked a turning point. Capable of firing thousands of rounds per minute, it changed how helicopters approached enemy positions. The sound alone was overwhelming. Continuous streams of fire cut through jungle lines and open ground. Door gunners now operated alongside weapons that could suppress large areas in seconds. However, increased firepower brought increased attention. Enemy fighters learned to recognize armed helicopters by sound and profile. The Huey became a priority target. Heavy machine guns appeared more frequently. Coordinated ambushes became more common. Helicopters flew into areas already prepared for their arrival. For door gunners, this meant constant engagement. Flights that once involved long stretches of observation now expected contact. Every approach was treated as hostile. Every extraction assumed incoming fire. The gunner no longer waited for danger to appear. He assumed it was already there. The helicopter's flight profile also changed. Armed Hueys often flew lower to deliver accurate fire. They slowed down to support troops on the ground. They circled landing zones repeatedly. Each of these actions increased exposure. The door gunner remained the most exposed crew member throughout. Despite new weapons, protection did not improve much. Armor added weight, and weight reduced range and lift. Designers prioritized engines and weapons over shielding. The aircraft's skin remained thin. Bullets penetrated easily. The open doors stayed open. Flak jackets were still issued, but their limits were well known. They stopped fragments, not rifle rounds. Many gunners chose mobility instead. Chest plates existed, but they restricted movement. In a job that demanded constant shifting and leaning, restriction could be deadly. The monkey harness remained the most reliable safety measure. It allowed gunners to lean far outside the aircraft without falling immediately. Still, it did not prevent injury. Sudden turns could slam the gunner against the door frame. Hard landings threw bodies sideways. Hanging suspended under fire was a real possibility. Combat missions grew more aggressive. Armed helicopters escorted troop transports. They scouted ahead of convoys. They hunted enemy positions along trails and riverbanks. Door gunners fired at fleeting targets, often identified only by movement or muzzle flashes. Coordination between helicopters became more complex. Multiple aircraft worked together, covering each other's blind spots. Door gunners communicated constantly over the intercom. Warnings passed quickly. Calls for ammunition. Calls for evasive maneuvers. Silence meant something was wrong. The psychological strain intensified. Armed Hueys were expected to press attacks even after taking hits. Smoke in the cabin did not always mean turning back. Damage assessments happened in the air. If the helicopter could still fly, the mission often continued. Door gunners watched bullet holes appear inches from their knees. They felt rounds strike the gun mount and ricochet away. They smelled fuel and hydraulic fluid. They learned the sounds of damage, a change in rotor rhythm, a sudden vibration, a warning light flashing in the cockpit. Casualties mounted. Crews lost friends aircraft by aircraft. Replacement gunners arrived with little experience. Veterans taught them quickly, knowing there was no time for slow learning. Some survived their first missions. Others did not. As the war dragged on, the role of the helicopter expanded further. Armed Hueys were used for rapid reaction forces, responding to units in trouble. Door gunners fired to protect soldiers scrambling aboard under fire. These moments were short and violent. Seconds mattered. Hesitation could mean death. The helicopter had become both weapon and lifeline. Door gunners stood at the center of this dual role. They fired to destroy threats and to protect evacuations. They watched wounded men bleed on the floor beside ammunition boxes. They continued firing while medics worked behind them. This period marked the peak of intensity for many crews. The air war over Vietnam was no longer experimental. It was mature, deadly, and relentless. Helicopters were expected to go where fixed-wing aircraft could not. Into narrow valleys, over treetops, directly above enemy fire. By the late 1960s, helicopter door gunners understood that not all missions were the same. Some flights were dangerous, others were deadly by design. Among the worst were medical evacuation missions, known by crews as dust-offs. These were flights where helicopters went directly into active fighting to pull out the wounded. Speed mattered. Firepower mattered. Hesitation cost lives. A dust-off mission usually began with a call from the ground. Soldiers were hit. Time was running out. The helicopter lifted immediately, often without knowing what waited below. Landing zones were rarely secure. Enemy fighters knew exactly where the helicopter would go. The wounded marked the location. The noise of rotors gave advance warning. Early in the war, medical helicopters flew marked with red crosses and carried no weapons. The idea was simple. Medical aircraft were supposed to be protected by the rules of war. In Vietnam, those rules did not hold. Enemy fire did not stop because a helicopter carried wounded men. Bullets did not respect markings painted on thin metal. As losses mounted, dust-off helicopters were armed like any other. Door gunners became part of medical crews. Their role expanded again. They were no longer only suppressing fire to protect landings. They were protecting medics and wounded men lying exposed on the floor. Approaches were fast and low. Pilots came in hard, flaring at the last second. Door gunners fired continuously into tree lines, tree stumps, and suspected firing points. The goal was not accuracy. The goal was silence. Silence meant survival. Landing zones were often small clearings cut by artillery or explosives. Smoke filled the air. Debris flew upward under rotor wash. As soon as the skids touched ground, everything happened at once. Medics jumped out. Door gunners leaned farther than ever, firing until the helicopter lifted again. Loading wounded soldiers was chaotic. Stretchers bumped against door frames, blood-covered floors. Some men screamed, others were silent. Door gunners helped pull bodies inside while keeping one hand on the machine gun. They had to switch roles instantly, from fighter to helper and back again. Sometimes there was no room to land. Helicopters hovered inches above the ground. Soldiers lifted wounded men upward while the aircraft shook violently. Door gunners fired at close range, watching bullets strike dirt only meters away. These moments felt endless, even though they lasted seconds. Dust-off missions rarely ended after one trip. Casualties came in waves. Helicopters flew back and forth between battlefields and field hospitals. Fatigue built quickly. Ammunition ran low. Gunners reloaded while airborne, hands slick with sweat and blood. One of the hardest tasks was deciding priority. Not everyone could be evacuated at once. Medics and crew had to choose who would go first. Door gunners witnessed these decisions from only a few feet away. They saw wounded men left behind, knowing another helicopter might not make it back in time. Enemy fire followed evacuation routes. Fighters learned patterns. They waited along approach paths. Helicopters took hits during climb-out, when they were heavy and slow. Door gunners fired backward, covering the tail and sides while the aircraft struggled upward. Many door gunners were wounded during these missions. Some continued firing despite serious injuries. Others collapsed at their positions, held upright only by harnesses. The machine gun did not stop unless the gunner did. Beyond medical evacuations, door gunners also supported emergency extractions. Ground units surrounded or pinned down relied on helicopters as their last way out. These missions were fast, violent, and unforgiving. Helicopters approached under heavy fire. Door gunners scanned constantly, calling out threats. Suppressive fire poured into suspected positions. As soon as the helicopter touched down, soldiers ran toward it. Door gunners watched them sprint through fire, knowing every second mattered. Bullets struck the aircraft during these moments. The sound was sharp and close. Metal rang. Plexiglass shattered. Door gunners stayed exposed, firing to keep the landing zone open. Retreat was not an option until the last man was aboard. Some gunners did not make it back inside before liftoff. They hung half out, pulled in by crew chiefs as the helicopter climbed. Others jumped out to help wounded soldiers reach the aircraft, trusting their crew to notice and return if something went wrong. Not all crews noticed in time. Stories spread among units of gunners left behind briefly in hostile territory. Some were recovered, others were not. These stories added to the tension every time a gunner stepped out of the aircraft. The mental strain reached its peak during this phase of the war. Door gunners were no longer just fighters. They were witnesses to constant injury and death. They saw men their own age broken apart by explosions. They carried wounded enemies and wounded friends alike. Sleep became shallow. Fear became routine. Many gunners described feeling detached, as if watching events from outside themselves. The next mission always came. There was no pause long enough to recover. Despite everything, door gunners continued to fly, not because they believed they were safe, but because others depended on them. Soldiers on the ground trusted the sound of helicopter guns. Medics trusted the covering fire. Crews trusted each other. By the final years of the Vietnam War, the image of the helicopter door gunner was fixed in the minds of everyone involved. A young man standing in an open doorway, machine gun pointed down, body exposed to the ground below. The stories followed him everywhere. The most famous was the so-called 5-minute life expectancy. Veterans knew the number was not precise, but they also knew why it existed. It captured how quickly things could end. Door gunners were the most exposed members of the crew. Pilots sat behind glass and metal. Crew chiefs moved between tasks. The gunners stayed at the edge for the entire flight. Enemy fighters understood this. When helicopters came under fire, the open doors were targeted first. Removing the gunner meant removing the helicopter's defense. Protection never truly caught up with danger. Helicopters needed to remain light enough to lift troops, fuel, and weapons. Thick armor was not an option. The aircraft's skin remained thin. Bullets passed through it easily. Even small arms fire could disable controls or wound crew members. Flak jackets were still issued, but their limits were well understood. They stopped fragments and shrapnel, not rifle rounds. In the heat and humidity, many gunners chose not to wear them. The weight slowed movement and drained energy. Mobility often mattered more than marginal protection. Helmets helped with communication, not survival. Chest plates existed, often called chicken plates, by the men who wore them. They could stop some rounds, but they restricted movement. Door gunners needed to lean, twist, and shift constantly. Many left extra armor behind. In practice, the only real protection was speed and firepower. Fly in fast. Fire hard. Leave immediately. Door gunners fired almost continuously during dangerous phases of flight. They stopped only to reload, clear jams, or help wounded men inside. As the war dragged on, exhaustion became constant. Door gunners flew hundreds of hours. Their hearing suffered, their joints ached, their hands shook even when not firing. Sleep came in fragments between missions. The psychological cost was harder to measure. Door gunners saw death at close range. They watched helicopters crash. They saw friends killed inches away. They pulled wounded soldiers into the cabin and watched some die before reaching hospitals. There was no distance from these events. No time to reflect. The next mission followed quickly. Fear became something to manage rather than eliminate. Many learned to push it aside until after the flight. Some never truly processed what they saw until years later. Decision-making under pressure left deep marks. Door gunners often fired at movement without knowing exactly who was below. The enemy blended with civilians. Young fighters hid among villagers. Mistakes happened. These memories followed men home long after the war ended. By the early 1970s, American involvement began to wind down. Helicopter operations continued, but the intensity slowly changed. Some door gunners completed their tours and rotated home. Others did not survive to leave. Those who returned often struggled to explain their experiences. Few people understood what it meant to hang out of an aircraft under fire for months. The job sounded unreal to those who had not seen it. Many veterans stayed silent. Despite the cost, the impact of door gunners on modern warfare was undeniable. Their improvisation changed military doctrine. Helicopters were no longer treated as fragile transports. They became central tools of mobility and firepower. Dedicated attack helicopters followed, designed from the ground up for combat. Later aircraft added armor, sensors, night vision, and advanced weapons. But the foundation was built in Vietnam by crews who learned through survival. Door gunners were part of that foundation. Their experience shaped how air assault operations would be conducted for decades. The war ended, but the memories did not. For many door gunners, the sound of rotor blades never fully faded. Sudden noises triggered reflexes. Open spaces felt exposed. Sleep remained shallow. Some found ways to cope. Others struggled for years. The bravery shown in the air did not protect them from the weight carried afterward. Recognition came slowly, if at all. What remains is the truth of the role. Door gunners were not reckless thrill seekers. They were young men placed into extreme conditions by necessity. They adapted, fought, and protected others at great personal risk. They stood where the helicopter ended and the war began. No armor, no walls, only air, noise, and responsibility. The story closes not with victory, but with understanding. The dark truth about door gunners is not only how dangerous the job was, but how much of them it demanded during the war and long after it was over.